The name was never meant to survive creation. Before Genesis ever spoke its first word, before light tore through the void, a name ruled the skies. Not Yahweh, not El Shaddai, but something older. Something so powerful the stars themselves trembled to sing it. That name was not erased. It was sealed by divine decree, not forgotten by time, but hidden by heaven. For when God said, "Let there be light," something else had to be silenced first, something too dangerous to remain. Scripture begins with order, but conceals the cost. In the beginning, God created, but what was displaced to make room for that beginning? What thrones were cast down so that one throne could reign alone? This is not myth, this is not poetry. This is the memory of a silence heaven still fears, and the name buried beneath that silence might be stirring again. The name before names. Before names carried power, one name was power. Before angels had rank, before stars had number, before the word holy was ever spoken in the halls of heaven, there was a presence, and it bore a name that ruled the skies. The book of Genesis opens with a command. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Genesis 1:1. But it says nothing of what came just before, that silent moment before time moved. Scripture is not silent because there was nothing there, but because what was there could not be spoken of. Jewish mysticism, apocalyptic texts, and forbidden scrolls speak in whispers. They speak of an ancient throne, of a dominion that reigned in the upper heavens long before the creation of man. Some call it the first glory. Others refer to it as the primordial authority, a power established before the divine name YHWH was revealed. In the Book of Enoch, the prophet is taken into visions where two thrones are seen side by side. One belongs to the Ancient of Days, the other to a chosen one who was with him before creation, Enoch 70:71. But some traditions go further. They imply that before even this divine arrangement, before even the angels, there was a singular throne, unchallenged, untouched, and it bore a name not found in any surviving tongue. What was this name? No scripture dares to record it. No angel is permitted to speak it, because it is not simply a name. It is the memory of a dominion that heaven itself had to overcome. The stars were not merely lights scattered in the void. In the language of Job, they sang, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth, when the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy?" Job 38:4-7. That joy was not the sound of beginnings. It was the cry of transition. Something had been removed, something had been replaced, and what they shouted for was the end of what once ruled. Even in the ancient Babylonian creation myth, the Enuma Elish, there is mention of primordial beings who reigned before the current order. They are always chaotic, always cast down. But chaos was not what came before. What came before was glory, too great, too unyielding to make space for what was to come. And so the name was sealed, not because it was evil, but because it was incompatible. It belonged to a reality where light had no meaning, because nothing had ever been hidden. It belonged to an age before obedience, before fall, before mercy. It is possible, perhaps even necessary, that God himself buried the name, that in order to bring forth creation, he had to silence even that which once stood nearest to his own presence. And if so, then the act of creation was not just an origin, it was a judgment. The heavens were not empty when God said, "Let there be light." They were watching, shifting, waiting. Something had been displaced. And heaven has never spoken of it since. But if the silence was divine, then so was the name it buried. And if that name ever stirs again, who will remember it, and who will dare speak it? Whispers of an ancient power. The silence may have buried the name, but whispers still echo in the dark places of theology. In the shadows of Jerusalem's temple walls, in the forgotten margins of ancient scrolls, there are fragments, half-veiled, half-erased, hinting that the skies were once ruled by a power older than all creation, not evil, not fallen, but too great to remain. Jewish mysticism speaks cautiously of a throne of glory that predates even the angels. Some rabbinic texts refer to it as the seat prepared before the foundations of the world were laid, Midrash Tehillim 93:2. But the question haunts the words, if the throne existed before everything, who sat upon it? In some esoteric strands of early Kabbalah, there are references to the Rishon Kedem, the first of the ancient ones, a presence so close to the infinite that its name could not be distinguished from the voice of creation itself. Some scholars dismiss this as metaphor. But Scripture never deals kindly with metaphors that dare sit beside God. In the Book of Daniel, the prophet describes a vision of the Ancient of Days seated on his throne, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. Daniel 7:9-10. But curiously, another figure is introduced, one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven, to whom was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom. Daniel 7:13-14. Who is this second figure, eternally enthroned yet distinct? Some say it is the Messiah, others claim it is Enoch, transformed. But what if it is a shadow of the forgotten, a remnant of the one whose throne was silenced? The Book of Enoch deepens the mystery. In chapters 70-71, Enoch is taken into the presence of two thrones. He is told, "You are the Son of Man who was born unto righteousness, hidden before the Most High, preserved in secret." 1 Enoch 71:14-17. Hidden, not created, known, not made, entrusted, not invented. This language mirrors the language of concealment, of something buried deliberately, not by accident, and it leads some to ask, if Enoch was transformed into the Son of Man, then what power made such a transformation possible? And more terrifying, what precedent was it echoing? Theologians have long debated the concept of two powers in heaven. Rabbinic Judaism eventually deemed it heresy. Why? Because to entertain the thought was to admit a second throne, a second glory, a second name. A name too easily associated with the figure Christians would later call Jesus. Rabbi Akiva, one of the most influential voices after the fall of the Second Temple, declared the belief in two powers as the dividing line between orthodoxy and blasphemy, and yet even he could not erase the lingering fear that the idea had merit, that the ancients knew something the canon was never meant to protect. For in every generation there are glimpses, flashes in art, in dreams, in prophecy and madness, visions of a presence standing beside God yet not God, speaking yet not named, moving across the firmament as if it remembers a time when it belonged to it. These whispers are not mere superstition, they are the fragments of a name too dangerous to write, and perhaps too holy to forget. Heaven did not bury the name to erase it, but to delay its return. And when that return begins, it won't come quietly. Why heaven feared the name. There are names that command reverence, and there are names that command fear. But this name, this ancient buried name, commanded both. Not because it was dark, but because it was unchallenged, because it belonged to something that could not be subdued, only silenced. The power behind the name was not rebellion, it was authority. An authority that did not fall, but was removed, not cast out like Lucifer, but set aside like a throne too large to fit the new kingdom. It is not chaos that heaven feared, but the permanence of what came before. In the scriptures, rebellion is met with wrath. The angels who fell with Lucifer were cast into chains of darkness, 2 Peter 2:4. The Nephilim were swept away in the flood. Babel was shattered by confusion. But this name is never judged, only concealed. Its absence is not marked by judgment, but by silence. Why? Because it was not evil, it was eternal. And eternity, unchallenged, is a threat to all things new. In Isaiah, God declares, "I am the Lord, and there is no other. I form the light and create darkness." Isaiah 45:5-7. This is not a denial of all other powers, but a declaration of sovereignty over them. For something to be named in Scripture, it must be brought under divine order. And this name was never spoken, because it was never brought under. Even in the throne visions of Revelation, where glory, judgment, and eternity are unveiled, only one sits at the center. Yet the text hints at what surrounds that center: elders, spirits, voices, lightning, the presence of hierarchy, of former glories still bowing in submission. Revelation 4:2-5. Heaven feared the name because it could not bow, not from pride but from position. It had never learned to kneel because it had never needed to, and in a cosmos now defined by worship, obedience, and humility, this was unacceptable. The watchers in the Book of Enoch sinned by descending. They crossed boundaries, teaching forbidden knowledge, corrupting creation, but even they trembled before the authority that preceded them. Their names were recorded, their judgment proclaimed, but the name that ruled before them was never uttered. This is why even angels fear to speak it. Gabriel, Michael, Raphael, each is named, commissioned, and ordered by God. They carry his commands, echo his will, but there is no record of them contending with the one who bore this ancient name, because it was not their equal, it was their memory. Heaven feared the name not because it threatened God, but because it threatened the shape of heaven itself. The throne room, the choir, the sacred geometry, all of it was crafted to reflect a divine order of worship and submission. But this presence predated the shape. It did not fit, it would not kneel. And so it had to be sealed, not because it sought rebellion, but because it was incapable of assimilation. And perhaps that is the greatest threat of all, not evil that defies God, but glory that cannot conform to him. So heaven buried the name, not beneath punishment, but beneath design, and in doing so created a silence loud enough to echo through eternity. But if that silence was designed, what happens when the design begins to unravel? The name hidden in the flood. The flood was never just about sin. That's the version we were given, the surface story, that mankind had grown corrupt, that violence filled the earth. And so heaven responded with judgment. And yes, that is true, but it is not the whole truth. There is something older buried beneath the waters of Genesis, something deeper than disobedience, a memory that had to be drowned, not because it was wicked, but because it would not die on its own. Genesis 6 gives us a glimpse. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took them as wives. Genesis 6:2. From that union came the Nephilim, giants of renown, beings of mixed blood and mixed authority. But behind that act of defiance was a knowledge, and behind that knowledge, a name. The Book of Enoch tells us more. The watchers, divine beings sent to observe, descended instead. They taught men secrets of heaven, metallurgy, enchantment, war. But what they passed down wasn't just information, it was inheritance. It was remembrance. They were not creating something new, they were restoring something lost. What if the knowledge they gave was not theirs to begin with? What if it belonged to the name that ruled before? And by reviving it, they reopened a gate that heaven had sealed. The Book of Enoch names the ringleader, Azazel. To him was ascribed the blame for all sin upon the earth, but even his name is not the oldest. He taught war, but not the first war. He taught power, but not the first throne. His fall was not origin, it was echo. And so the waters came, not just to erase corruption, but to silence memory. Psalm 29 offers a strange vision. The voice of the Lord is over the waters, the God of glory thunders, the voice of the Lord breaks the cedars. Psalm 29, 3-5. This is not gentle rain, this is violent divine interruption. The flood was the voice of God, unleashed, not to reason with the earth, but to wash it clean. Clean of what? Clean of the story no one was meant to tell, clean of the fragments passed down through bloodlines, clean of a name that still shimmered in the ruins of the antediluvian world. Even Noah, the righteous man, was not told everything. He was instructed to build, to survive, to preserve, but he was not told what had been buried beneath his feet, because survival was not about understanding, it was about obedience. Understanding would only bring remembrance, and remembrance would bring return. The ark was a vessel not just for life, but for forgetting. God's covenant after the flood was sealed with a rainbow, but that rainbow arced over a grave. Not just a grave of flesh, but of knowledge, of legacy, of a name too glorious to allow back into the story. So the waters receded, the earth dried, and a new world was born, but deep beneath the layers of sediment and silence, the name still sleeps, and what the flood tried to erase, time may one day remember. Buried by command of God, there are things too dangerous to destroy, powers that cannot be unmade, only hidden. And the name that once ruled the skies was one of them. When God chooses to destroy, it is swift, fire from heaven, flood across the earth, cities turn to ash. But when God chooses to bury something, it means he intends for it to survive, just not in this age. This is what separates punishment from sealing. Destruction ends a thing. Burial preserves it in silence. The ancient name, the one that predated the angels, that held glory without worship and power without submission, was not destroyed in the flood. It was buried, hidden not in stone, not in fire, but in design, sealed away by the will of God himself. Isaiah hints at this mystery. Truly you are a God who hides himself, Isaiah 45:15. The Hebrew word used, mistata, implies deliberate concealment, not absence, not weakness, but divine secrecy, a choice to remain unseen. Could it be that God did not just hide himself, but also something else, something too radiant to be erased, yet too incompatible to remain? This idea is not foreign to Scripture. In Revelation, a scroll is sealed with 7 seals, held back until the time is right. Revelation 5:1. In Daniel, the prophet is told, "Seal up the vision, for it concerns the distant future." Daniel 8:26. Even truth, in God's economy, has a timing. And sometimes the holiest thing he can do is hide what is true. Perhaps the name was not buried in punishment, but in patience, not out of vengeance, but out of mercy. Because what if that name still carried power? What if it still responded when called? What if speaking it, even by accident, could disrupt the architecture of creation itself? In Exodus, when Moses asks to see God's glory, God answers, "You cannot see my face, for man shall not live and see me." Exodus 33:20. Not because God is evil, but because man is not ready. The holiness would be too much, the encounter fatal. So it is with the name. God's silence was protection, his concealment an act of love. If the throne that once ruled was not evil but eternal, then it was not cast out like Lucifer. It was set apart, preserved, not as a relic, but as a warning, a witness, a sealed truth awaiting its appointed time. And perhaps that's why Scripture never mentions its destruction, because God never gave that command. Instead, he did something far more deliberate. He buried it in the fabric of time, folded it into memory, coded it into the silence between verses, and then he waited. Because one day the seals will break, the silence will lift. And when that name is heard again, it will not whisper, it will thunder. The return of the forgotten, Silence does not last forever. Even divinely ordained silence has its limits. What God seals, he can unseal. What he hides, he can reveal. And what he buries, he can resurrect. The name that once ruled the skies was not erased. It was only waiting for the moment when time could no longer contain it, waiting for a generation reckless enough to call it forth, knowingly or not. In Revelation, when the Lamb begins to break the seals, each crack is not just the beginning of judgment, it is the unraveling of concealment. When he opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. Revelation 8:1. A silence within silence, not emptiness but anticipation. The stillness before something buried speaks again. The prophets were shown glimpses. Joel saw signs in the heavens and blood on the earth. Ezekiel saw wheels within wheels and fire unfolding itself. John saw a name written that no one knew, but the one who bore it. Revelation 19:12. These were not fantasies, they were echoes of a glory hidden before the foundations of the world. And perhaps the greatest echo is this: as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be in the days of the Son of Man. Luke 17:26. The flood silenced the name once, but the return of the Son of Man is not to bring silence, it is to unveil, to reveal what was hidden in fire and buried in water. What if the final shaking of heaven and earth is not just judgment, but remembrance? What if the stars fall because they recognize the return of the one they once obeyed before Yahweh spoke? What if the end is not the fall of evil, but the reappearance of something more ancient than the story itself? God is not the author of confusion, but he is the keeper of mysteries, and the return of the forgotten is not a contradiction, it is a fulfillment, a thread buried in Genesis that re-emerges in Revelation, a throne that never broke, a name that never lost its power. Some will deny it, others will fear it, but the heavens will know it, because they never truly forgot. And when the veil tears for the last time, when the seals are gone and time collapses into eternity, the name will rise. Not in rebellion, not in shame, but in brilliance. It will not be written in ink. It will be thundered in light. It will not be spoken by man, but by creation itself. And in that moment, every power that shaped the world, from angels to kings, from stars to beasts, will remember who ruled the skies before the first command was ever given. And so will you. A warning from eternity. This is not just a story about a name, it is a reckoning. Because what God hides, he hides with purpose. And what he reveals is never without consequence. The ancient name that once ruled the skies, sealed by divine design, buried in silence, drowned beneath flood and time, was never meant to be forgotten. Only delayed, until the world was bold enough to ask and broken enough to need the answer. You were born into a world that remembers nothing and fears everything. But the heavens remember, creation remembers, and somewhere deep within your spirit, so do you. When that name returns, it will not come with titles or trumpets. It will not seek a throne, it will be the throne. And every soul, whether defiant or devoted, will be forced to choose. Ignore what heaven tried to warn, or awaken to what heaven never truly erased. So listen closely, not with your ears, but with the place in you that still trembles when truth walks near. Because some names don't fade, they wait, and now they're beginning to rise.